holy disruptor this week is Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day was born in 1897, and she was a prominent American journalist and social activist. She was a devoted Catholic, and she co-founded something called the Catholic Worker Movement. She's known for this. She's known for tireless advocacy for peace and social justice and for working with and for the disadvantaged here and around the world. And Day's journey toward this actually started very early in her life. Her family was caught in the San Francisco earthquake of 1906. And that was a very severe earthquake, which I did not know about till I read this. And this left her father, who is a sports writer at a newspaper, without a job. And it left devastation within the community. But she got to see that community pull together and really go out on a limb to help everyone who's in need. And this really started her on a path. She drew an important lesson about social action and the Christian community that she took with her after her family moved from that area. They relocated to Chicago at this point. She started going to the Episcopal Church at this time, so she did have religion in her background. But she was also an avid reader in her teens. Her literature formed who she was at a deep level, particularly books like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which is about life in slums and poverty, if you've not heard of that. She also really liked Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. She read a lot of socially conscious books, which helped form her support for and her involvement in social activism. She graduated from high school in 1914. She spent 2 years in college, and then she moved to the Lower East Side of New York City. And by this time, she was a screaming radical by any measure. She started working on the staff of several socialist publications with names such as The Liberator and The Masses and The Call. And she was a socialist, she was an early communist, and she was an anarchist. By November 1917, she was arrested for picketing at the White House on behalf of women's suffrage as part of a campaign organized by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. She was sentenced to 30 days in jail. She served 15 days before being released, 10 of them on a hunger strike. And now I don't know what you were all doing 3 years after graduating from high school. This is not what I was doing with my life at that time. That's what I was thinking as I was reading this. She was a remarkable woman. Day spent the 1920s, or the Roaring Twenties, you may have heard, living what was referred to as the Bohemian life, which means she was on the leading edge of the social change that was happening in America at that time. The 1920s were a decade of huge economic and cultural change. Lots of prosperity and economic growth. This is after the recovery from World War I. There was a boom. This rapid expansion in technology like phones and cars, rapid cultural shifts, things like the Harlem Renaissance, the Art Deco movement, the Jazz Age, and all of this also came with the sexual revolution. The spread of political philosophies, such as communism and socialism and anarchy, also featured during this time. And Dorothy Day was right in the middle of all of that. In fact, she spent the next 13 years as a writer and a journalist making connections with well-known movement leaders, famous authors. She became an author herself alongside being a journalist. There was actually one exception, though, in this particular lifestyle that she was leading. In the year 1920, she had a bad relationship, and it ended in her getting an abortion that she had a hard time recovering from, both mentally and physically, and which led to her almost immediately getting into a bad marriage with somebody else and writing what she called a bad book about all of it. She was not a fan of this book afterwards. So she divorced within a year, and then she sort of came back to the life that she was leading before. But so if you are going to go read Dorothy Day's books, do not read her first one. She does not recommend it. So bringing up this period is important, though, because she thought that she was unable to have children after this due to the physical problems she had recovering from her abortion. So it was miraculous to her when she became pregnant in 1925. There is a really wonderful account from the website futurechurch.org that states, unlike many people, including many saints, who experience a conversion to God out of a sense of guilt or sorrow, Day turned to God in joy. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I often felt after the birth of my child. With this came the needs to worship and adore. It was because through a whole love, both physical and spiritual, I came to know God. This is when Dorothy Day became Catholic. It was also the beginning of a very difficult period in her life that would lead to the work she would do for the rest of her life. She, at this point, found herself a single mother. And she was on her own, and so she was poor, almost by definition at that time, because she did not have family or friends. She didn't have a network supporting her. She was doing various jobs to support herself and Tamar, her daughter, including working for 2 Catholic publications at this time. And there was a point where they sent her to Washington, D.C. in 1932 to cover the communist-organized Hunger March and Farmers' Convention. And there she had another type of conversion experience. Here she could be classed as a member of the working poor. She was reporting on this march, and first she observed, and as she observed it, first she wondered, why is the church not here marching? Why are they not out organizing to alleviate poverty? And then she thought, what am I doing just covering this? Why am I not out here marching and organizing to alleviate poverty? So before she left this profound experience that she had, she went to the National Shrine at the Catholic University of America, and she prayed that God might open up a way for her to use the talents that she had for her fellow workers and for the poor. So God answered that prayer immediately. She returned to New York, and she found a guy literally waiting on her doorstep for her. And this is a guy named Peter Morin, and he had been sent to her by her editor who knew her interests. And Morin had an idea. He had this idea for a radical form of Catholic life, which involved feeding and housing people who had no food and shelter. It involved forming farming communes and houses where people could come and discuss theology and philosophy. And they immediately started to make this happen. By 1933, and this is 3 years into the Great Depression, they launched the Catholic Workers' Movement, with Dorothy Day starting a newspaper by that name. All of the writers at this paper had begun to live in voluntary poverty so that they could take in the hungry and the houseless in New York City. And during the Great Depression, as you probably know, there was a lot of that going around. In Dorothy Day's autobiography, The Long Loneliness, she describes how it started out just being, like it started out from her own home. At first, she was just feeding people who happened to come by her house, but soon a line started forming at her door every day. She said, when you break bread with people, when you share soup, as the two disciples did with Christ on the road to Emmaus, you see Christ in your fellow humans. The Catholic Worker newspaper was an unapologetic advocacy paper. It covered strikes, it explored working conditions, especially for women and African American workers. It explained Catholic teachings on social issues. It explained how people could take action locally. It listed all of the union shops and stores that people could go and patronize. It also was unapologetically pacifist, and people on both sides didn't like that. The church was often unhappy with her because of all of the progressive reasons that I just listed, because those are very progressive stands, especially for the time. The church is not always very progressive. But the church was especially mad when she started publishing pacifist things in her newspaper during the Spanish Civil War, for example. And on the other side, the communists and the anarchists and the labor movements all had, in various places, they had militant wings that were returning violence for violence. And she writes that she actually spent a lot of her life explaining to her leftist friends that pacifist even means pacifist in the class wars. That's how she put it. There was always tension in her work. Her friends and family and her comrades would ask her, how could you become Catholic? And how could you be a radical and belong to the church at the same time? But for her, that was what kept her going. She would write about how even from the time that she was a child, she and those around her who experienced poverty could find deep joy and moments of glory and connection with God in prayer, in the stories of the saints. Those particularly touched her through her life. She joined the church because that was where she found God. That was where she found the strength to do what she did from day to day to day. She certainly didn't join the church for the church's sake, I can tell you. She was a thorn in the side her entire life. It's actually really funny if you read some of these accounts. But she wrote, as a convert, I never expected much of the bishops. In all history, popes and bishops and father abbots seem to have been blind, power-loving, greedy. I never expected leadership from them. It was in the saints that keep appearing all through history, who keep things going. What I do expect is the bread of life, the Eucharist. And down through the ages, there is always that continuity. She also wrote, what I feel about the institutional church, for me, it is a place in the slum, in our neighborhood, where it is possible to be alone, to be silent, to wait on God. No matter how corrupt the church may become, it carries within it the seeds of its own regeneration, which I thought was a wonderfully profound view. As her work progressed over the years and her Catholic worker movement spread and grew, her shelters for housing and feeding people began to spread into other areas. They would eventually be across the country. She didn't have much time for rest, and she found her strength in daily prayer. her inspiration for what she was doing in the words of the Gospels. Like Bonhoeffer, like we talked about last week, the plain interpretation of the words of Jesus. For Day, it was especially in the Sermon on the Mount, and in parables like the one that we heard today. When I was hungry, you fed me. It's a quote from her. We feel so powerless. We do so little giving out soup. But at last we are facing problems daily. Hunger, homelessness, greed, loneliness. The greatest concern of the Bible is injustice and bloodshed. So we share what we have and we work for peace. And much of her notable work, especially later on, revolved around peace and her pacifism. In the 1950s, when the Cold War was ramping up, there were mandatory bomb drills. There were mandatory safety drills, and just judging about how we all feel about red alert drills at our children's schools, she probably quite correctly felt that these were terrorizing the population to some extent. And she forced, and it was by law you had to participate, and she did not. She decided to sit in the park by herself one day, and then got people to join her, and this picked up speed, and through picketing and refusal, both of which landed her in jail at one point, she helped get this stopped.
We'll get you a new set later.
In 1965, Day hoped that the Second Vatican Council would endorse nonviolence as a fundamental tenet of Catholic life and denounce nuclear arms. Both their use in warfare and the idea of arms being used as deterrents to establish a balance of terror, is how she put it. She lobbied bishops in Rome, and she joined with other women in a 10-day fast. And they did adopt this in Vatican II. This was a major victory that the church denounced the use of nuclear arms then. And Dorothy Day never slowed down. This is like 10% of what I could have written about her. I mean, she has a packed life, and there's so much written about her as well, not even just written by her. But I'd say she does one thing is for sure, is that she did never slow down. She continued her fight for workers' rights, and she supported the work of Cesar Chavez in organizing California farm laborers. And in the summer of 1973, she joined Chavez in his campaign for farm laborers in the fields of California. She was arrested with other protesters for defying an injunction against picketing, and she spent 10 days in jail. And remember, she was born in 1897. So she was in her, I don't do math very well, but she was in her 70s at this point. Day made her last public appearance at the Eucharistic Congress, held on August 6 in 1976. It was in Philadelphia at a service honoring the U.S. Armed Forces on the United States bicentennial, and I imagine they invited her to honor her work and her contributions. They did not do their homework. She spoke about reconciliation, but she also spoke about penance. And then she criticized the organizers for failing to recognize that for peace activists, August 6th is the day that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And she informed everyone that it was an inappropriate day to honor the military. And you know what I love, though? It's around this time in her journal, this is what she was writing. She wrote, "How little I can do these days, but suffer patiently the innumerable small difficulties of aging." Like, how little. She's getting arrested. She's lecturing the U.S. military. But other than that. But she does go on. She said, "And always prayer, which is a joy. Psalms are always joyful ones on Thursdays in honor of the Last Supper. And where else would we have room save at home for so much joy and suffering? What wisdom does a remarkable woman like this share at this point in her journey? Wisdom earned from a long life of fighting to see God's kingdom realized on this earth. She writes, "We know how powerless we are, all of us, against the power of wealth and government and industry and science. The powers of this world are overwhelming, yet it is hoping against hope and believing in spite of unbelief. Crying by prayer and by sacrifice, daily small, constant sacrificing of those things of one's own comfort and cravings. These are the things that count. I am convinced that prayer and austerity, prayer and self-sacrifice, prayer and fasting, prayer and vigils, prayer and marches are the indispensable means, and love. All these means are useless unless animated by love." It is my prayer that her example and her faith will inspire us, and that when we find this world to be an overwhelming place, we can also hope against hope and believe in spite of unbelief, and see those difficult times through by prayer and, above all, by love. Amen.